featuring Steve Keller, the audio alchemist. And this is really fun because, as Steve was saying just before we went live, we're talking about the power of sonic transformation. And here we go. I'm super excited to welcome Steve. He's going to be one of the Voicefluencers coming up on the June 23rd episode of The Voice Den. And wanted to bring him on the show so we can hear a little bit about all the incredible things that he is up to. So Steve, welcome. Great to have you here.
Thanks, Terry. Happy to be here, chatting with you and everybody else that's listening. Thanks for the introduction. And yeah, I like this idea of my superpower being the power of sonic transformation. That speaks to who I am and what I do.
I love that. I love it. So along those lines, I'd love for you to give a little bit of introduction to who you are, what you do, and maybe I'll get you to tie in a little bit of that sonic transformation concept in your introduction
Sure.
if you can.
Sure. So I'm Sonic Strategy Director for Studio Resonate, which is an in-house creative consultancy for SXM Media. And XXM Media is our kind of parent brand where we work with brand clients on the SiriusXM platform, Pandora platform, Stitcher platform, and we also represent the North American advertising for SoundCloud. So everything that's platform related. My job as Sonic Strategy Director, because I often hear from folks, wow, that's a really cool title, but what the heck do you do? Is basically to blend sound science with sound art to help our clients make sound decisions. And that's where the alchemy piece comes from it. In the Jungian sense, an alchemist was a magician in a way, somebody that was able to take something very ordinary and transform it into something wonderful and special. So for me, it is this idea of how do we take what we know about the science of sound, blend that with what we know about sound from the perspective of art and creativity. And if you do it right, there's a little magic that comes out of that helps us think about how we're using music and sound to shape perception, to influence behavior, to enhance experiences. And that's where my world gets really wild and interesting and wacky and goes off in all sorts of directions.
And I've had the opportunity to hear some of the stuff that you're working on Clubhouse, and it's incredible. Lots and lots of stuff. I love that, the blend of the science and the art. As you may know, I'm a musician. I know that you are a musician. And so maybe you can talk a little bit about that, like what your background, how did you get into music, and why does this interest you so much?
It's really I feel fortunate that I'm in a position that's a convergence of the main passions in my life. And when I grew up as a kid, my parents bought me a Disney album called The Great Composers. And I was fascinated with the composers, fell absolutely in love with Beethoven, wanted to be Beethoven, with the exception that I didn't want to lose my hearing. But
Good point.
I wanted to play the piano that way. So at 6 years old, I started taking piano lessons. Eventually, as I got older in junior high, I had a cousin who visited and was playing the guitar. I thought, oh, that's great. So taught myself how to play the guitar, started writing songs in high school, mainly because it was a great dating tool, way to meet girls. But I never thought about music as a career. I was really interested in psychology and human behavior, helping professions. So when I went to university, that's what I majored in. So I graduated with my degree in psychology, and the plan was to go off to grad school, work on a master's or PhD. But music was always there in the background. And so I didn't really have an aha moment. I just gave myself permission to do something different. And I wound up heading to Nashville instead of heading to grad school. And in Nashville, did a number of things, but my claim to fame that kind of broke me into the music scene was in the early 90s. Country music was exploding everywhere, and people were showing up at these dance clubs and doing these country line dances. And eventually it grew into a thing where they weren't just country dance nights, they were actually country dance clubs, and there were DJs that started asking the country labels for extended mixes, for beat mixes, for these things that in country nobody knew what to do with. And I happened to be a guy who knew how to do a dance remix. And I was one of two guys in Nashville at the time that
Wow.
could do that. So I started getting hired to do that, and worked with artists like Tim McGraw and Neil Diamond and Leonard Skinner and Winona. And on the tail end of that, I started doing music for commercials, and found that I really loved advertising and branding, not just doing music for commercials, but the discipline of advertising and marketing. And it was in 2005 that I picked up a book that had been written by a guy by the name of Daniel Jackson, who was an early pioneer of sonic branding. And when I read this, that was my aha moment. It was this blend of psychology and research, music, sound, entertainment, advertising, and marketing. So started my own company in 2005, grew that to where I had an office in Germany, doing a lot of work in Europe as well as work in the US. And I eventually popped up on Pandora's radar speaking at a conference, and they invited me to come to speak at Pandora. That led to other speaking engagements and then consulting on a few projects. And after a while, when we looked deep into each other's eyes, we decided it was a match made in heaven. So we were going to put a ring on it. And I actually closed my company, was hired the end of 2018, moved out to Oakland, and here I am now talking to you with tiny beers in front of me.
Just little shot glass sized beers. We've been joking about that. That's fun. Wonderful. That's really cool. I want to transition a little bit to now you've been involved with voice and diversity as well. And that's just so, so you've got this incredible background now in the music world. And how did you sort of take that turn to get into the area of voice and diversity and those things that we've had the chance to talk about on Clubhouse?
Sure. Well, as you can imagine, as I dove deeper into sonic strategy and moved away from the world of production as much and more into consulting, that actually drew me back into academia. So I started working with a lot of academics like Charles Spence, who's head of the Cross-Modal Research Laboratory at Oxford, Daniel Muhlensiefen, who heads up the Music, Mind, and Brain program at Goldsmiths University in London. And in doing these research projects and looking more at how sound really does shape our perception and influence our behavior, began to kind of get back into the psychology of things. And when COVID hit, obviously the world is sounding a little different. I'm paying attention to that. And happened to catch a YouTube video where a guy by the name of Microsoft Sam spliced together all of these COVID commercials. And the title of the YouTube video is "Every COVID-19 commercial is exactly the same." And it looked the same, it sounded the same. It was funny how 70 some brands, all of these things fit together. A couple of months later, there was the murder of George Floyd. And so confronted with that, thinking about that, and then noticing the response from brands and advertisers to the Black Lives Matter movement. Started looking at those ads. And obviously there was some similarity to COVID ads in terms of the seriousness of the topic and the discourse. But one of the interesting things for me is noticing the difference in the voices. So in the Black Lives Matter ads, you had Black voices that you were hearing, Black talent, Black individuals, as you would expect, given that topic. But when I looked at the COVID ads, the interesting thing to me was, as I went through and started tabulating the voices in this montage, 90% of those voices were white. And here we've got a pandemic that in the US was affecting the Black population 3 times as much as the white population. So why am I only hearing white voices? Which then got me thinking about, maybe we're just defining the general market from a sonic perspective, as white. And
Interesting.
by extension, the voice of America as white. So again, kind of the psychology background for me kicked in. I had read a book a couple of years ago by an author by the name of Jennifer Lynn Stover called The Sonic Color Line, where she kind of traces this idea of race as a sonic construct, not just a visual or a textual construct. And as I looked at the history, particularly of radio and ways in which Black voices had been marginalized, and then seeing that in our industry, and even in the development of newer technology, we're talking about voice, AI, voice recognition, and seeing that there's kind of a discrimination where the error rate for Black voices is much higher than white voices. So we launched an initiative from Studio Resonate called Stand for Sonic Diversity, and listeners can find it at standforsonicdiversity.com, where we're tasking advertisers and brands to really look at their voiceover rosters, their casting practices, and trying to get them to cross this sonic color line and bring us a more diverse world, not just from what we're seeing, but from what we're hearing.
Really interesting, and what a great initiative. As you were describing that, it made me start thinking. And have you thought at all about using Clubhouse as a source for research, because it is so based on voice? Now you do have little pictures, little avatars, but it almost makes me wonder if there's things that you can do in rooms where you remove the pictures or have people change their pictures. And anyway, I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Well, yes. And, it's interesting, when I did the research, and I started with a pretty in-depth literature review, and trying to look at how do we define the sound of a Black voice? What makes a voice sound Black? And again, realizing that in voice, it's not just the speaker, it's the listener. And so there's this thing that Jennifer Lynn Stover calls the listening ear. I call it racialized listening, in which I do believe we have othered voices in different ways. Because if you look at the literature, you find that, biologically, there's no reason why the voice of a Black individual or a white individual would sound different. So what are we picking up on as listeners? Well, there's the first thing are dialectical cues.
Sure.
So if a Black individual is speaking with African-American English or African-American vernacular English, we may pick up on some of those idioms, some of the pronunciations. But let's move that marker. So then what are we left with? Timbrel markers. And for most of us, we would perceive voices that are lower in pitch, more resonant, and a higher harmonic noise ratio, which kind of is raspiness, as a Black sounding voice. But I'd contend that those timbrel markers aren't coming from the voice of a person because they're Black. We're hearing them as Black. And that's why there are Black speakers who sometimes are misattributed as being a white speaker, because we're not picking up on the dialectical or the timbrel cues. And so we end up stereotyping it as white as opposed to Black. And so Clubhouse, it would be really interesting, if everybody had the same photo or let's just say a color, if they were all white dots that we were looking at. My guess is that would prime us. So if there was a voice that didn't have these cues, we might assume that it's white.
Oh, interesting.
Or
yeah.
if they're all Black dots, that may prime us in another direction, because our research has shown us that these primes are important. I also think that depending on how data collection is happening on Clubhouse, they may be analyzing not just voice timbre or voice qualities, but speech patterns, rhythm patterns, volume patterns. And that these are things that also can be used to stereotype. I mean, Jennifer Stover in her work talks about cop voice and the way that police actually will change the way they speak to a Black individual. And it usually has to do with pitch, with tempo, and with loudness. So all of these factors are at play sonically in our racial discourses, but we don't think about them. So I'm concerned that if we're not careful with the technology as we build the algorithms, we may bake in some prejudice.
Yeah.
Because we're listening to rooms in certain ways and identifying these conversations as Black or white. But what does that really mean? What is it that we're baking into the algorithm?
It is so fascinating, and this is, I know, just like scratching the surface of what we can get into here. It is just remarkable. It also, we had a comment here from Lisa from Clubhouse saying hello to saying hello to us.
You raised the bar.
I raised I raised the bar. Lisa saying hello. So hello, Lisa. And it also made me think, just as you were talking about how cops change the tone of their voice, Lisa's in the education space. And it also makes me wonder, just like, not even necessarily when you racialize voice, but just having different voices for different roles, your teacher voice, your whatever voice.
How do we talk to our kids? How do we talk to our pets? Yeah, I mean, these are all really natural, but they're also socialized. And bringing it back to race is a social construct. It's how have we built that construct. And you can look at how, in terms of gentrification and the terms of the dominant culture, what would it mean to succeed? And you can look at movies like Black Klansman or Sorry to Bother You, where the storylines of those movies are, the Black heroes that succeed because they are able to sound white. And so it's really all really interesting. And I feel like I'm just scratching the surface, and also have to point out that, the obvious fact that I'm white, and as a white cisgender heterosexual male, I'm at the top of the privilege food chain. And so this work for me has been personal. It's been humbling, and it's also required me to think about my own listening habits.
Sure.
And where do I need to be aware of prejudices that exist?
This is fascinating. We're definitely going to have to, I hope we have the opportunity to dive into this a little bit more on Monday when you're going to be joining me on Clubhouse. I'm looking forward to that. I do want to be respectful of your time. And I know there's another area that I just want to touch on here so people can get a little taste of, what's going on in your mind with regards to this. And that is how other senses affect the way that we hear things, whether it's vision of colors or taste. And I'd love to get maybe a little bit of it's going to be hard to do this, but an overview, a snapshot of what you're thinking in that sort of area.
Yeah, I'll try to be brief. I'm more aware of your time, trying to keep it to 30 minutes. I've got enough buffer on the other side of this.
Wonderful.
But essentially, I think I'll start by giving the context. Most people have heard of synesthesia. And synesthesia is a condition where your brain is literally cross-wired. So sensory input from one sense triggers the sensory response of another. So I may see a color and I may smell it, or I may hear a sound and that may generate a shape or a color, or in some individuals, a scent. So this phenomenon also occurs in those of us who are non-synesthetes in a very natural way, and that's what we call cross-modalism. And that's built on the idea that we literally make sense of the world around us, understand reality through sensory input. And our senses are so intertwined that if we understand how that works, we can literally hack one sense with another. So think about it this way, even in our language, if I describe something, I may say, oh, that sounds sweet. So I'm using a taste word for a sound word. But we know what that is, which is probably, it means it's going to be high pitched, probably has some fast attack in things. And if I were to say to a composer, hey, I'm working for a coffee brand, it's a really robust, rich, dark coffee. Probably without any more coaching than that, what I'm going to hear back from the composer is something that's lower in pitch, maybe a little slower in tempo, maybe using some stringed instruments to get a little rosin in the bow. And that's all happening naturally. If I show you two diagrams, and one diagram has all these kind of rounded edges and another diagram has sharp edges, and I'd say one of these is a booba and one of these is a kiki, which is which? Most people would say, well, the booba is the one with the round edges. The kiki obviously is the one with the sharp edges. Well, why is that? And so what our brain is doing is it's trying to look for congruencies. So knowing what that is, we can use congruent associations or incongruent associations to change the perception. So bringing this into practical application, we found, particularly in the area of taste and flavor, that sound really does have a huge impact on our perception. So, we've been able to create soundscapes that will heighten your experience of sweetness or bitterness or spiciness. I have a new paper coming out with Charles Spence and Janice Wang, who's another researcher that I work with, on salty soundscapes, salty sounds, things that kind of enhance saltiness. And we see how sound impacts our dining experience in restaurants. So really loud, noisy environments tends to cut the flavor. We tend to eat faster, and we can tend to consume more. So your sonic diet tip would be, when you're eating, lower the volume of things, lower the light level, maybe put on some music that's a little slower, and you'll tend to stop eating sooner and have more of a sense of being full, and it cuts your calorie intake. So, these are just some of the ways that we can use these aspects. Think about it in the healthcare settings where maybe you have a diabetic patient, needs to cut sweetness out of the diet. Well, maybe with soundscapes, we can put some of the sweetness back in. Or a person on chronic treatment, like a chemotherapy person, who most chemotherapy patients will tell you their senses get out of whack with the chemotherapy treatments. So could we use sound to offset some of that sensory experience, as well as color or some other senses that may bring that back? But I think the idea of cross-modalism, to me, is more prevalent and rich in dining experiences, because it is such a multi-sensory experience for us. We're usually just not cued in to everything that's going on in the world around us. And if we just changed the soundscape, or changed the weight of the silverware, or the color of the dinner plate that we're eating off of, all of those things actually have an impact on our perception of how they're tasting, on the flavor.
That's incredible. Oh my goodness. There's so much there to unpack as well. I feel like we need like 20 sessions here, but that's the beauty of being able to talk now and talk in the future as well. Here is another comment from one of our listeners, and this is from Dr. Rupal Patel. Love the idea of sound therapy, Steve. So I don't know if you have any comments about that comment, but that's wonderful. I love that, Rupal.
I will say, and Rupal, I know you. We're actually going to be on a panel, and so I'll send you an article that Charles Spence and I wrote that came out in the Journal of Music and Medicine about a year ago, that looked at the use of music, soundscapes, and noise in hospital environments, and the effect on not only patient outcomes, but patient satisfaction. So we looked at everything from the operating room to perioperative care to death and dying to nutrition to multisensory aspects. And it was basically a massive literature review on the topic. So there's all kinds of research. And I think, particularly here in the States, we could do a much better job of sonically addressing what happens in health environments, particularly with noise. I mean, you just think of the machines that are going off and people being traumatized by sound in a healthcare environment. So there are people that are, addressing that. In fact, earlier this week on Clubhouse, we had a conversation with Joe Schlesinger, who's at Vanderbilt Medical University. He's working in this area. And Tom Middleton, who is a London DJ, who's now creating soundscapes for Calm, the Calm app, and working on his master's at Goldsmiths. So there are people that are addressing this, and people that are much smarter than I am.
Incredible. I feel like we have to have a follow-up session to this, Steve, at some point, just to dive deeper into all of this stuff. So along those lines, I am absolutely thrilled that you're going to be joining us as one of the Voicefluencers for the Voice Stand. And one thing that I like to ask all the guests here on the Voicefluencer Show is, the format of the Voice Stand is people get to come and they ask you questions. And so what are and I'm sure we've got a taste of it just now, I'm sure, but what are the things that you love to have questions asked of you about? What are those topics that you love to talk about? And like I said, I think we've got a taste of it here, but go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I think obviously in my work in marketing and advertising, I'm always interested in talking about new and creative ways that we can use sound as part of brand experiences. But the other part of my work really looks at what are problems in the world that maybe we can find sonic solutions for. So I call those the opportunities for sonic intervention. And we've touched on that a little bit, talking about music and sound in healthcare. But what are other ways? We're understanding the power of sound and the way the chemicals in our brain react and interact with sound. Can we encourage pro-social behavior? Could we encourage people to order things off of a menu that are more healthy for them, based on what might be playing in the environment? Can we look at noise in cities and cityscapes, or look at issues like race? And is maybe a discussion around sound an interesting entry point that might help us have some really tough discussions, just because we're providing an interesting context that people haven't thought about, and it cuts through some of the filter and the biases that are built up, that are already there when we're talking about it from a political or a visual standpoint. So, anything about perception, behavior, and ways that, sound has transformed your life.
I love it.
The power of sonic transformation.
From the audio alchemist's mouth right there. Absolutely. And here's somebody that's been listening in, and Lisa says, Steve, your amazing insights are off the charts. Wow. So that's a great comment to
I appreciate
finish
that.
off with. Wonderful. Steve, where can people go to learn more about all the stuff that you're doing? Where would you direct them?
Well, as I said, if you're interested in what we're doing with the Sonic Color Line work, standforsonicdiversity.com. Find me on LinkedIn. That's a great place. If you are on Twitter, you can look for Audio Alchemist _. Don't forget the underscore at the end. Clubhouse, Audio Alchemist, or just Google me. I've even got a TEDx talk out there that will pop up. But you can reach out to me through any of those portals.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for spending some time with me and with the audience. It's incredible to speak with you. There's just so much here that I'd love to dive into, and like I said, we're going to have a chance to do that more on Clubhouse coming up, and we are going to have a chance to speak with you on the Voice Stand. So the episode that you are a part of is on June 23rd on the Wednesday at 5 p.m. Pacific. And come on, come all. Come and talk to the Audio Alchemist and learn about sonic transformation. Steve, Thank you so much for being part of the show. Really, really
Thank you,
appreciate it.
Teri. I'm looking forward to the upcoming conversation and always great to chat with you. So thanks for having me.
Take care.